Dr. Tim Gilmore is the author of over 20 books, including Channeling Anna Fletcher from 2018, The Mad Atlas of Virginia King in 2015, In Search of Eartha White, Storehouse for the People in 2014. He is the founder of the Jax by Jax Literary Arts Festival. He's the creator of JaxPsychoGeo.com, a project exploring nearly 600 stories from his hometown. He teaches writing at the Florida State College-Jacksonville. Dr. Gilmore has written for numerous Florida and national publications. He's been recognized by the Cultural Council of Greater Jacksonville as its 2018 Literary Artist of the Year. He's received Florida State College-Jacksonville's Distinguished Faculty Award and the City of Jacksonville's Melody Star Ann Bishop Community Service Award for his service on the Jacksonville City Council's Civil Rights History Task Force in 2018. I've told you many good things about Dr. Gilmore, but I've saved the very best thing about him for last. Yes, he holds a PhD in English from the University of Florida. Go Gators. Thank you.
Was wondering what that very best thing about me would be. I didn't know that was it. So first of all, thank you for coming out tonight. This does not necessarily sound like the most savory subject, right? I'm grateful for the Jacksonville Historical Society for hosting this, and I've seen lots of friends out there, and I've met some new people. Well, you're not new, but you're new to me tonight, so that's a good thing. And I especially am thrilled to see, I won't embarrass them, but my daughters and my sister Wanda and my wife Jo, who is my best friend and the best reader in the world. So, Warren Folks' story is often strange. It's sometimes bewildering, sometimes maddening. But you came out tonight, and despite the rain and the fact that there's a jumbo shrimp game and you're not there, and I don't want to punish you for it, so I'm not going to subject you to a long stream of, vile and vicious bile. I'm going to focus largely, not entirely, but on history according to what Warren Folks protested. You can see business cards on the screen here. He often wrote his name as the H, his middle initial, making this look like his name was Warren White Folks. And this Knights of the Ku Klux Klan is watching you is from an envelope that he sent to reporters at the Florida Times-Union. He did that often for decades. So, I'm not going to tell you every time Folks was held in contempt of court. I won't tell you about the pheasants he kept in his barber shop. I won't tell you about his accusation that federal marshals hid evidence by eating 420 pounds of apricot seeds. I won't tell you about his claim that losing his Senate race was a result of computer fraud because the election was stolen. I won't even tell you what black political candidate supported Warren Folks. At one time, the most famous self-avowed, or famous or infamous, self-avowed white supremacist in Florida, or what black political candidate Folks once voted for. But I might suggest that if even somebody like Warren Folks once voted for a black political candidate, then maybe voting is just, the first step in democracy. It's not the end. I will, however, start with this. Warren Folks rose in an era of the far-right culture warrior politician in the South. That stance was a response to civil rights victories. We are now in another era of culture warrior politicians. Here's some context. So, under the Confederate flag is Alabama's George Wallace, who was governor first from 1963 to 1967. Wallace's policy and attitude is probably best represented by his most famous line from his inaugural gubernatorial address when he said, "I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever." In the middle on the bottom is Georgia's Lester Maddox and his son following a nonviolent black protester out of Maddox's Atlanta restaurant. Maddox made the axe handle, and you may have heard of an event called Axe Handle Saturday that happened in Jacksonville. He made the axe handle the symbol for his successful campaign for governor. In the middle, at top, is Florida's Claude Kirk, also governor from 1967 to 1971. Kirk called himself, to quote, "a tree-shaking son of a bitch." And the Miami Herald called him Claudius Maximus. As a stunt in his opposition to desegregation busing in 1970, Kirk left Tallahassee for Bradenton, where he theatrically suspended the school superintendent and the entire school board and holed himself up in the Manatee County School Administration building. He directly disobeyed a U.S. District Court order that he appear before a judge for contempt of court until the court charged him a daily $10,000 fine as long as he remained inside the building. In July of 2023, Thomas Edsel of the New York Times wrote of right-wing politicians' arguments that anti-racism is conceptually distinct from, quote, the various measures of anti-black prejudice. Anti-racism presents as disgust with efforts to fight racism, as though the whole problem of racism is a matter of the past, and anyone who thinks otherwise is equivalent somehow to a racist of yesteryear. In his recent book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, Ibram X. Kendi writes, "There is no neutrality in the racism struggle. One either allows racial inequities to persevere as a racist or confronts racial inequities as an anti-racist. There is no in-between safe space of not racist. The claim of not racist neutrality is a mask for racism." And that is Warren folks on the far side with the Wallace for President sticker behind him in his barbershop in 1965. However, look, this subject can be painful, and we have to take it seriously. We have to use it to demonstrate what we're against and what we're for. But here's a couple of other facts. There's this German word you've probably heard at some point, Schadenfreude. Usually when people introduce the word Schadenfreude, they say, of course it was the Germans who came up with this word. It means the glee you could feel at someone else's discomfort. And I suggest that you might feel a good bit of Schadenfreude reading The Culture Wars of Warren Folks. Also, there's the fact that the best satire is often realism. Also, lest we forget, we can be angry and also laugh. Here's an example of all those things. March 25th, 1976. Folks, he actually did this frequently. Here's an example. He placed a large ad in the Florida Times-Union to declare the anniversary of his being released from prison the last time. The ad bore its own headline, which folks had also penned. The headline said, "Keep fighting, Warren, we're with you all the way." Keep in mind it was Folks himself who wrote this. For more than a decade, the ad said, Warren has been fighting with his back to the wall, almost single-handed, but he is being forced to enter the hospital tomorrow for eye surgery. Again, keep in mind, Warren Folks is the one writing this. To show our appreciation for the gallant fight and the great sacrifices he has made over the years for law and order, there's that phrase, states' rights and constitutional government, we urge all of his 18,000 voter friends and all other supporters to flood Warren with a get well card shower, enclosing a love offering to this great patriot who has given so much of himself for the cause of liberty. The ad finished by saying that financial donations would help pay for the ad and would help in folks' next race for Senate. When Warren Folks first came to Jacksonville in the early 1960s, he connected quickly with George Lincoln Rockwell, founder of the American Nazi Party. Rockwell regularly stayed at the Robert Meyer Hotel. There's a postcard for that in the middle, which stood right next to Hemming Park, which is now, of course, James Weldon Johnson Park. Rockwell also stayed at least a couple of times with Warren Folks in his Jacksonville apartment in Riverside. Folks eagerly joined the local Nazi effort despite, and I'll come back to this, having fought in World War II. Shortly after landing in Jacksonville, handing out pamphlets in Hemming Park was the beginning of a long, hypergraphic, hateful career of political provocation. These are also, on either side, images of Rockwell's commune-like headquarters in Arlington, Virginia, which people quickly began to call Hatemonger Hill. So two different mayors here, and a really important civil rights activist in the middle, Rutledge Pearson. This image is from Jet Magazine. This is Hayden Burns, and this, and I'm not entirely sure why he looks like he's climbing up out of the sewer, but is Burns' successor, Mayor Lou Ritter. At the end of May 1965, Warren Folks and a few of his colleagues, I guess you could call them, were protesting two black policemen being assigned to traffic detail. Mayor Lou Ritter had taken a different tack than his predecessor, Hayden Burns, on racial justice and segregation. Burns had promised that Jacksonville's businesses and public spaces would never desegregate racially. Jacksonville re-elected him 4 times. You might call Burns Jacksonville's George Wallace. On Tuesday, May 11th, 1965, Ritter spoke to the city commission responding to a petition folks claimed carried more than 600 signatures that demanded that black police officers be reassigned to, quote, Negro sections of the city. Ritter said instead, the downtown business area is open to all our citizens, white and Negro. The biggest media coup of this early part of Warren Folks' career as culture warrior was his appearance in the April 23rd, 1965 issue of Life magazine. Those two black and white photos underneath Sinatra are Warren Folks from that issue. The cover of Life magazine showed Sinatra in his white turtleneck and pumpkin-colored sweater and herringbone fedora. Folks was even more high on hate than usual when Life reporters interviewed him and several other hate merchants, in Folks' words, earlier in his shop. The Florida Grand Dragon, the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, was there. So were Barton Griffin, Gene Wilson, and Don Spiegel, whom J.B. Stoner, the attorney who would defend the murderer of Martin Luther King, had successfully defended the year before in Jacksonville for bombing the house of a 6-year-old. That's the 6-year-old. His name's Donald Godfrey. He was the first black student at Lackawanna Elementary School. The bomb blew the refrigerator through the roof and obliterated that side of the house. Luckily, Donald and his mother, Iona, have been sleeping on the other side. An all-white jury acquitted each of the Klansmen, except for one who had pled guilty and informed on the others. And that is Donald Godfrey and his mother Iona today. This is a film. This is a promo for a film that an Atlanta director named Hal Jacobs has put together that will be showing in Jacksonville in February, probably at Sunrise Cinema in Riverside. Next year will be the 60th anniversary of the bombing. Donald Godfrey is a retired U.S. diplomat who lives in Ghana. When I met with Hal Jacobs and Donald and Iona, Donald was talking about how much safer he feels in Ghana than he feels in the United States. I mean, this is someone who, when he was 6 years old, the Klan bombed his house. And as an example, he said he's much more aware of race in the United States, and that he just feels a constant fear. And the example that he gave was, that he could just go into public somewhere and there might be a mass shooting. This was a few months really before, of course, the shooting that happened outside Edward Waters University a couple of weeks ago. So, March 22nd, Times-Union's Lloyd Sangren took a photograph on a riverfront city parking lot showing Warren Folks waving a giant Confederate flag with two white men in dark suits holding placards and a single automobile in back. Affixed to the top of the Confederate flag was a small sign. It's hard to read from a distance. It said, "This small white march is in protest of the Big Black March in Alabama." The Big Black March was actually a series of civil rights marches to register black voters and campaign for voting rights. So, some background, and even if you know this, it's, I think, worth hearing again. Though the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, passed immediately after the Civil War in 1865, abolished slavery except within the prison system, and the 14th Amendment, passed in 1866, granted formerly enslaved people citizenship, though American Indians continent's indigenous people would not become citizens until 1924. And the 15th Amendment, passed in the 1870s, said citizens could vote, though citizens implicitly meant men, since women would not be able to vote until 1920. The South's Jim Crow laws had done everything possible to block the black vote. They passed white primary laws, disallowing the black vote in primary elections. They levied poll taxes, which had to be paid in order to vote and frequently were not applied to white voters. They required literacy tests for voting, waiving the test for illiterate poor whites. They passed requirements of black voters own property. They defrauded, intimidated, even terrorized black voters. When the U.S. finally gave women the right to vote in 1920, black leaders, including Eartha, Mary Magdalene White, and Mary McLeod Bethune, ran voter registration drives in Jacksonville and Daytona, hoping newly enfranchised black women voters would also bring dispirited black men to vote. Ku Klux Klan parades terrorized black voters before and on Election Day throughout Florida, including in Jacksonville. Downstate in Ocoee, white supremacists murdered 50 to 60 black residents in response to voter registration drives. 4 civil rights activists lost their lives in those 1965 voting rights marches and the campaigns in Alabama. Meanwhile, in Jacksonville, 3 bitter white men marched in Warren Folks' quote, small white march. And I want to ask, these are both pretty famous photographs, but I think this one less so. How many people know who this is? Anybody? That's right, yeah. This is the activist, and at this point, future United States Representative John Lewis. This police officer fractured his skull that day. So, this is what was at stake. And so, question and answer here. Just what made the Voting Rights Act so terrifying to Warren Folks? Answer, these women. President Johnson had signed the Voting Rights Act in 1965. 2 years later, Mary Singleton and Sally B. Mathis became the first black women elected to city council in Jacksonville's history. The first black council members elected since Jim Crow laws had disenfranchised the black vote. Soon, Singleton, at the far end there, ran to become Northeast Florida's first woman state representative and first black state legislator. Warren Folks ran against her. He lost. 1967, H. Rap Brown, 5th Chairman, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, stood in the center of Durkee Field, facing hundreds of black supporters gathered to hear Brown's message of black power. This is H. Rap Brown. This is Governor Claude Kirk. Brown's message at the time was that white people had lots and lots of guns, and white police officers all had guns, so black people should get guns too. The Black Panther Party of Self-Defense had formed the year before, and Robert F. Williams' 1962 book, Negroes with Guns, had catalyzed the movement. Just as Brown began to speak, the strangest, most Floridian thing happened. A white, hayseed politician, Claude Kirk, 36th governor of Florida, a Jacksonville insurance salesman, hopped the fence at the baseball field and tromped toward the pitcher's mound. The Associated Press quoted Kirk, "I went to the meeting to represent law and order. Meanwhile, George Wallace's presidential campaign supporters in Florida splintered into factions. Dick Smith, organizer of Wallace's national campaign, arrived by plane on an emergency mission to clear up the fighting between Wallace groups. Jacksonville, Smith said, was turning into a problem for Wallace. This is Dick Smith. This is Warren Folks. Smith told the group not to attend the so-called Father's Day testimonial dinner in support of Wallace at the George Washington Hotel on June 14th. Warren Folks was sponsoring that effort. There's only one official Jacksonville dinner coming up, Smith said, on June 19th at the Robert Meyer Hotel. We want all Wallace supporters to come there. Smith refused to take a phone call from Folks at his meeting, so Folks showed up at the campaign office on East Adams Street and members of his own group. Several dozen Wallace supporters circled around Smith and Folks on the sidewalk. At first, Smith shook Folks' hand, but then told him, "You're no longer associated with us." The various Wallace groups headed by Smith and Folks quickly descended into shouting matches and accusations of stealing funds. Some people thought maybe they were about to come to blows. Soon, Folks ditched George Wallace, his stated reason, and that's an envelope that he sent to the Florida Times-Union explaining his reasoning, was that George Wallace was not conservative enough. So, whenever the censors came for Mickey Spillane's books, the writer showed up to make the most of the free publicity. This is actually, I knew of Warren Folks. There's a chapter in Rodney Hurst's book. It was not about never about a hot dog and a Coke, called Warren Folks. That's the name of the chapter. But last November, I was looking up Florida book bans, the history of Florida book bans, and I ran into Warren Folks, 1970. At this time, Mickey Spillane, in his late 40s, and his wife, Sherry, half his age, were up front about her posing nude for his book covers in order to increase sales. So, when the Conservative Citizens Council of Jacksonville, Florida, complained about Spillane's newest novel and head librarian Harry Brenton pulled it from the shelves, the best-selling author came to town. While feminist groups surely didn't care for Spillane or his book covers either, the Conservative Citizens Council was Folks' newest group. He set up an appointment with City Council President Jake Godbold. Folks called the book hardcore pornography and demanded that Godbold call the whole city council together on the spot for an emergency session. Didn't happen. Folks told Godbold he wanted to halt in all funding for the public library system until all books in Jacksonville's libraries had been screened. Godbold, to his credit, scoffed. Might sound familiar. Godbold accused Folks of creating a scene for political exposure, noting the segregationist barber had launched a writing candidacy for state legislature in the upcoming election. Meanwhile, Mickey Spillane came to town. He held a press conference at the Hayden Burns Library. Spillane loved these kinds of fights. He said, "I get a kick out of these idiotic maneuvers with political overtones. He recommended Folks read far more offensive, if also more literary novels like Philip Roth's Portnoy's Complaint and Gore Vidal's Myra Breckinridge. The U.S. Navy had charged Warren Folks with disrupting military exercises when, in November 1972, he picketed Jacksonville Naval Air Station protesting, quote, the way the Navy handled shipboard racial cases. The Navy argued Folks had violated a federal statute against interrupting the operation or endangering the morale or discipline of the base. Details remained murky at first, but Newswire has reported the Jacksonville segregationist barber had attempted to force his way into the office of Rear Admiral Lawrence Geist, commander of Fleet Air Jacksonville, to protest the Navy's handling of 123 black sailors in San Diego who refused duty aboard the USS Constellation, alleging racial discrimination aboard the ship. Folks accused the U.S. military of, quote, surrender to black rebels. The sailors said they'd been airing grievances during peaceful protests, while Captain J.D. Ward claimed they were trying to start a violent uprising. Suddenly, though the number of sailors aboard the ship had not increased, the Constellation was deemed overcrowded and sailors were administratively discharged, which meant less than honorably. Almost all of them were black. Folks' protests at Naval Air Station Jacksonville were dramatic. In fact, if you read the book, I hope you'll get a laugh from reading about a slow-motion chase across base in which a security officer on a golf cart nearly pinned Folks against a tree. The incident led to Folks' longest court battle and a sentence of 150 days in prison. Folks held rallies for the first two Saturdays of March 1977 in Hemming Park at the center of town in support of CARE, Citizens Against Increased Electric Rates, to organize, quote, righteously angry citizens into people power. On Saturday the 12th, the longtime segregationists led a rally of mostly black participants beneath the palm trees and sodium arc lights in the Central Park. A white activist held a large sign that said Judgment Day for JEA in front of a hanging effigy of Managing Director William Irving. Folks also burnt an effigy of acting JEA Chairman Preston Haskell. Around the same time came this lead and a different story. Political activist Warren Folks was arrested again today, this time for an alleged assault on a police officer in City Hall. Sergeant K.D. Walker, investigator and security guard for the mayor, said he'd taken Folks' shotgun Monday night as the barber demonstrated. The gun was confiscated after Folks said he would stay all night to meet the mayor in the morning. He was charged with loitering and released. When Folks returned on Tuesday, entering Walker's office outside the mayor's office on the 14th floor, demanding the guard return his gun, Walker refused and asked him to leave. Folks then swung his arm across Walker's desk, knocking everything on it to the floor, and shouted obscenities. He banged on the desk and wielded a leather razor strop with which he threatened, as the Times-Union said, quote, to whip the officer's buttocks. On May 2nd, a lead in the Jacksonville Journal ran, it's going to be a lot more difficult in the future to get into the mayor's office on the 14th floor of City Hall, particularly if you happen to be carrying a shotgun. Indeed, I've been screaming for something like this for 7 years, said Jack Newsom, Mayor Hans Tansler's chief press aide. I've never had any luck in arguing for stronger security. But it took Warren Folks only one day to convince everybody of the greater need. After stronger security was put in place, the newspaper published this picture of folks making what they called a victory lap past the mayor's office. This is the first time that there was gun security put in place in the mayor's office in Jacksonville. In 1972, the U.S. Supreme Court had invalidated death penalty laws based on effects ruled arbitrary and discriminatory, commuting such cases to life sentences and starting a de facto moratorium on executions. Most states quickly rewrote their capital punishment laws, and the Supreme Court reinstituted the death penalty in 1976. There were no executions in the United States from 1967 to 1977. At that time, Florida's new death penalty law was considered, quote, a model for the nation, and Florida, quote, the nation's leader in the death penalty. John Spankalink was executed at Florida State Prison at Rayford in 1979 for the 1973 murder of small-time crook Joseph Shemankiewicz in Tallahassee. Warren Folks, however, claimed prison officials tortured and murdered Spankalink prior to executing him to stop him from implicating them in drug trafficking. Folks called it, quote, a conspiracy to keep John's mouth shut. Around the country, in the spring of 1981, headlines read, "Body of executed man exhumed today." Folks had ensconced himself in the home of the mother of executed murderer John Spankalink in Buena Park, California. He'd lobbied to have Spankalink's body exhumed and examined and convinced Lois Spankalink to sue the state of Florida on behalf of his Conservative Church of Christ, headquartered in his downtown Jacksonville barbershop. Folks assured Lois she could sue the state of Florida for $1 million, and Lois, in turn, promised to donate the money to the Conservative Church of Christ. And I'll let you read the book to find out what happens. This brings us up to 1991. Judge John Santora gave an interview to the Florida Times-Union in which he made statements blatantly racist, sexist, and anti-Semitic. Activists demanded Santora be removed from his judicial duties. The Reverend Jesse Jackson came to Jacksonville 3 times to hold rallies calling for Santora to be held accountable. At a January 3rd rally in front of the Duval County Courthouse, civil rights activist Bob Ingram spotted Times-Union photographer Bob Mack, broke ranks momentarily to put his arm around Warren Folks, put on a big friendly smile, and asked Mack to snap their picture. The papers called the sight a momentary truce, after which the two men got on with their picketing. There's a history here, though. Back in 1966, during Folks' first candidacy for political office, he made false charges of assault against Ingram, as he himself was being arrested for giving teenagers rocks and instructing them to throw them at black people. After the judge dismissed Folks' charges, Folks had said that instead of assaulting him, Ingram, quote, may actually have saved my life a couple of times. So Ingram's gesture in 1991 meant something quite different for him and for Folks than it did for almost anyone who saw their picture in the papers. So, you know, I thought quite a bit about how to what kinds of things to include in this talk, and I didn't want people to feel brutalized by coming out and I could just tell you 500 offensive things that Warren folks did and said, and what would be the point? I also don't want to make light of it, but I do think that at times, if anybody's ever read Charles Portis, he was this great novelist. One of his best-known novels is Masters of Atlantis. I do think that Warren Folks' story often reads like a Charles Portis novel, but I don't want to lose sight of the fact that what Warren Folks did for 4 decades hurt a lot of people. But I also want to ask, why was this guy who he was? I think it's important to ask this kind of question. What made Warren Folks Warren Folks? I mean, it's one thing to just kind of on one side of things, make fun of the guy. That's easy to do, But there are lots of Warren Folkses out there. Maybe not as extreme as him. Maybe not people who have the energy that he had for as long as he had. But at the same time, I talked to a lot of people who remembered him, who said, you know what? Actually, a lot of what Folks did would probably fit in with today's political landscape. And I came of age, maybe politically and culturally and socially, in the 1990s, and I think there was this understanding that this false understanding that progress meant that problems of the past were done and you had moved on, right? So something strange has happened since then, I think. But I wanted to end the book by asking, what made Warren Folks Warren Folks? And I talked to both of his daughters. I'm not going to say a lot about that. I don't name them in the book. I quote them extensively at the end of the book, but I never give their names. But they have both come to very different kinds of conclusions about their father. They also both live on the opposite side of the country. But they've also both, been haunted by him all of their lives. So it's impossible to really say what makes a person who that person is, right? I mean, people are complicated. People are ecosystems. But I found a number of really interesting things, and I'll just share a couple of them with you, and there are plenty more in the book. On the 1st of March, 1946, Warren Folks, still in the U.S. Navy, boarded a ship called the Prinz Eugen. This was a former Nazi war cruiser. Surrendered to the British Royal Navy, who transferred the ship to the U.S. as a war prize. The ship left Philadelphia and moved through the Panama Canal out to the Pacific Ocean to the ancient coral atolls of the Marshall Islands. That's the ship. That's the Prinz Eugen. The picture on the far side, top corner, is a picture of some of the people, the indigenous people of Bikini Atoll, that the U.S. government forcibly removed so that it could use the island for nuclear weapons testing. Less than a year after the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the U.S. continued atomic bomb tests on Bikini Atoll. What Warren Folks saw or didn't see, how he reacted to inhabiting a former Nazi cruiser, And exactly what he did to help prepare the ship for nuclear testing are questions you might have some clues to, but ultimately are lost to time. The Prince Eugene, by the way, remains in the Marshall Islands, which is a scattered republic comprising 1,225 islands and islets. The Navy moored the Prince Eugene less than a mile from the epicenter of 2 atomic bomb blasts in July 1946, then towed the ship 200 miles to Kwajalein Atoll, where it capsized, leaking oil and saturated with radiation, and sank. In 2018, the U.S. removed what oil remained. The Prince Eugene's stern and propeller assemblies still protrude, facing the atoll from the surface of the ocean. Meanwhile, these are Warren Folks' parents. This is Warren Folks' brother, Thomas, and this is Warren Folks. His daughter attended church with her grandfather, the Reverend Thomas Folks, who, she said, in his sermons spewed hatred for black people and Jews and what he called sodomites. She mourns the person her father might have been, for that person was in him as well. And the person he became was never the man he'd had to be. This is her thinking, her feeling, but only one of countless eventualities. She says she mourns the multiple ways her father might have been a totally different man. And I guess this is a spoiler alert. The very end of the book says this: maybe if that had happened, she told me, you would be writing a completely different book. Thanks. Not sure with Alan sneaking around behind the screen if there's any time for any questions.
I don't dare get between the audience and the screen when it's Tim Gilmore's illustrations. Dr. Gilmore is going to be around to sign more copies of his books. I'm pretty sure I'm safe in saying that. Are there questions or comments for Dr. Gilmore before we wrap up? Yes, ma'am.
Is there any evidence of the way Warren's father treated him? Do you punish him?
Sure, yeah. So thanks, Carol. So the question is there any evidence of the way that Warren's father treated him? Yeah, there is. He was, Warren Folks grew up in Ocala, and his father was as I mentioned, a preacher. And so he grew up with this very stern, hardcore, kind of fundamentalist preaching. And what I understand is that his father was very harsh, and he was patriarchal, surprise, and everybody in the family was underneath his discipline, physically and otherwise. And so it's hard to imagine that his Warren Folks' future thinking was not strongly, influenced by that. Yeah. Yes.
Did Mr. Folks' other daughter take the same view of his life and legacy as the one you described?
So the question is, did Warren Folks' other daughter have the same view of him and his legacy? So again, I don't name either of them in the book. I felt kind of protective of them. One of them I have actually texted back and forth with quite a bit over the last several months. They both came to quite different ways of dealing with their father's legacy. I don't think they differed over the facts about their father and ways that he treated their mother and treated them, and the reason that actually their family moved from Florida to the opposite coast. But one of the daughters, didn't talk to him for decades and tried to reconcile a relationship with him right before he died. And I understand why she needed that, The other daughter says that she forgives her father for nothing. And, but she also mourned really hard when he died. In fact, she said that he died in 2011, that recently. She says that, she was surprised by how hard his death affected her, and that she came to an understanding that she was mourning the father she wished she had had. So two sisters, I understand completely both of their very different ways for thinking about and trying to deal with the fact of their father. So it's a really good question. Yes?
So it doesn't surprise me necessarily that like the United States, Florida College-Jacksonville is going to raise up white racists. And so that's not surprising to me of who he is. But what is surprising to me, so then I guess Jacksonville was a population of about 250,000 people. And so here's this guy who rises up and has some political influence. So when I was listening to this story, it made me think, so can we do that with like more progressive anti-racist people now? And how do we go about doing that?
Oh, wow, that's a great question. Yeah. So Warren Folks seemed tireless. He wasn't, but he never let up. Decade after decade after decade, And so I think that's part of the answer, there are several younger people in the community that give me a lot of hope. Whether they are people like Andrew Pantazzi, who runs the Tributary. He left the Florida Times-Union. He's a journalist. The Florida Times-Union, for whatever you want to say about it, went from 200-something reporters to 20-something reporters in about 10 years. And there's the death of, newspaper journalism in America. But Andrew Pantazzi left and started the Tributary, and I'm just astounded whenever I hear and talk to this guy and read him how knowledgeable he is, So following people like that, I think. Also, you can tell, it's no surprise how I feel about racism and things like that. In lots of ways, I don't want to get into particular current politics, but I am quite enamored of the passion and courage of Angie Nixon right now.
Yes.
So, I've seen her in multiple settings. I've seen her in a church setting where she just listens and listens and listens. And I've seen her angry at James Weldon Johnson Park, and making national news for, the things that she has said about cultural warrior governors, the present one, and its relation to the shooting that happened outside Edward Waters a couple of weeks ago. So your question was, how can we, I think, if I remember, it was, so Warren Folks rises up in this town and makes whatever thing he made of himself. How can we focus on and maybe foster people who are doing the opposite sort of thing? Right, yeah, right. You know what? It is astounding how much an individual can do and get done and get attention for and raise awareness for. It can be really frustrating to look at national politics and just feel, squashed by things. But you know what? When it comes down to local levels, it's all about what individuals do. It always is. So I think your question is a great statement in and of itself. I don't know, one more? Okay, one more? Yes?
How has writing this book affected you, and how does it make you feel about your own town?
Sure, yeah. How did writing this book affect me, and how does it make me feel about my hometown? I love Jacksonville. I want Jacksonville to be the best city it can be. I think there are wonderful, wonderful things about Jacksonville, and I say them all the time. I've also had people send me messages and say, I hate the way you write about this city. Jacksonville has a problematic history. So do, and I'm not letting Jacksonville off the hook by saying this, but so do most cities. So does every city, in fact, if we're honest about it. And Jacksonville is a city of great stories. No taking away from that, complicated stories. I grew up here. I have written in several different places about some of the things I grew up with. The fact that my father, who passed away 4 years ago and was 95 years old, one of the people that he idolized growing up was an uncle named Phil Gilmore. This was in central Georgia. And I grew up hearing this, to my dad, heroic story about how Phil Gilmore was a police officer in Georgia, and he went to arrest this, and my dad always put it this way, he always said, this great big black man. And that he pulled his gun, never said why, pulled his gun, and the person went to grab the gun, and my father's uncle shot him through his own hand and killed him. My dad told me the story when I was growing up often, and it was this heroic kind of story, this shot through his own hand, what a self-sacrifice. I began to hear that story very differently as I grew older, as I became a teenager. I recently, I looked for these, there's all kinds of other things, other stories that would take me hours and hours. Don't worry, Alan. I look for records of these things often, and I recently found a story that had not been in the particular archives I was searching for before, that named the person that my not so great uncle, Phil, killed, named him, and explained the story a little bit more. And that's part of where I'm from. So so I grew up here, and there's lots of fascinating stories here, and I want to research them, I want to dig into them, I want to tell them, I want to be honest about them. So there's that.
So 30 or 40 years from now, a scholar from some institution of higher learning here in Jacksonville will be making a presentation here titled, "What Made Tim Gilmore Tim Gilmore?" And they'll look to the recording of tonight's program for some clues to answer that question. Well, we're on an FSCJ roll, the Florida State College-Jacksonville roll, and I say that because we have heard from Dr. Gilmore a number of times, presentations here at the JHS, always a fresh perspective on Jacksonville stories, and our next upcoming speaker series program will be on October 18th here at Old St. Andrews. The presenter will be FSCJ's Professor of History, Scott Matthews, talking about Jacksonville's history and a course that he has developed with his colleague, Jen Gray, who's in the audience. Jen, wave your hand so people can see you. Thanks very much. Jen Gray represents the library at FSCJ and is a close collaborator in the development of that course on Jacksonville's history. We look forward to that program and other upcoming events. We're so grateful to all of you for being history-minded citizens of Jacksonville and for showing that by showing up. Thanks very much, and stay safe and have a great evening.